Ok, eh, buenos días a todos. Nuevamente a nuestra. se- um, ah, Good morning to everybody to our sessions at the Katz Center, our pláticas about Mexico. Continue with the series of this quarter devoted to Mexico in the world and the war in Mexico. I'm very happy to welcome Jesús Cháirez-Garza, which is lecturer in the history of race and ethnicity at the University of Manchester. It is a great pleasure for me. It's been my goal, and it has been my desire for a long time, not very successfully, I must say, to encourage Mexicans to study something else than Mexico. Not very successfully, but I jumped into the opportunity of assisting Jesús in his goals when many years ago he contacted me with the idea of studying something than Mexico. Imagine my emotion, my excitement when he decided to learn Hindu and study in the Colegio de Mexico a master in Indian history with my distinguished colleague, Zoro Dube, and then going to study a PhD in Indian history at the University of Cambridge. His book, based on his dissertation, it will come out this year by the University of Manchester, and with the title Untouchability as a Political Idea, an Intellectual History of B.R. Ambedkar. And this is what he's going to talk about. We've been discussing for many years, and we were hoping also to have Professora Wakuja today, which also works on these issues and has done something on India and Emenroy. But today we have Jesus, who is going to talk to us about these strange links between two important intellectuals, one of Mexico, José Vasconcelos, and one of India, Ambedkar. Jesus, thank you for accepting to talk to us. Welcome to the Katz Center.
Thank you so much, and I'm also really grateful about meeting you. Actually, like it was somewhat of I remember it a bit different, because I remember I was in Texas, in Austin. I was doing a semester abroad exchange, and Artemio, my stepdad, he sent me to go and meet you, and I went reluctantly, and I was based at the Latin American Studies Center, and I remember you saying something of the like of, why are you in the Latin American Studies Center? Study something else. And I did. I decided like to do I was already doing international relations, but I decided to go with India. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen very quickly. To share a presentation, and as Mauricio mentioned, can you already see my yeah?
Yes, it's fine. It's
yeah.
fine.
As Mauricio mentioned, I'm presenting something that I usually don't do, which is work on Mexico. I am basically a Saudationist by training. All of my knowledge of historiography, it's based on Indian history. But my PhD was basically or I like to focus on global intellectual history. So coming from there, and having studied global intellectual history, I found some links between the period that I studied, which is basically the early 20th century. The person that Mauricio mentioned before was B.R. Ambedkar, and he's the main character, the main historical character in my PhD dissertation. But this bit is not about Ambedkar, it's about some Indians, revolutionaries, namely people like Pandurang Khankhoje, Hardayal, Heramlal Gupta, who were at the same time in the United States as B.R. Ambedkar. And all of them were linked to different universities. Some were linked to Columbia, some were linked to the University of California at Berkeley. And there was an exchange inevitably with Mexicans. For instance, B.R. Ambedkar, who, if you don't know him, he was a contemporary of Gandhi. He right now he's very fashionable because in some way he comes from a Dalit caste, an untouchable caste, as they used to be called. And he was one of the main critics of Gandhi. So Ambedkar is famously known for being a disciple of John Dewey. And of course, there are many disciples or at least that they claim to be disciples of John Dewey and the people at Columbia, whether it's Moises Sáenz or from Boas, like someone like Manuel Gamio. So my interest in this period took me to those to see and to study those pistas, if we can call them that way. And it was there when I started to find some links between India and Mexico. More importantly, so this started basically as my interest in pragmatism, and now I'm doing historical anthropology. But this bit, it's a little bit different. This bit, it's about intellectual history per se, particularly in the way we think of Vasconcelos. So one of the things that I want to mention before we moved on is that I'm not trying to do a revisionist history of Vasconcelos. I see the problems with him, but I'm trying to think about how bringing an India influence to the focus of to Vasconcelos might let us think a little bit in a different way of things, of concepts such as mestizaje. So I used these two life stories, particularly Pandurang Khankhoje and Vasconcelos, to try to reimagine alternative intellectual histories of South-to-South cooperation. I know, like someone or a lot of people do not like this term Global South, but even someone like Vasconcelos used that term Sur to refer to this area of the countries he was speaking of, particularly India and Mexico. So in rather than focusing on the way some people that have produced very good work on people like Pandurang Khankhoje, such as Gabriela Soto Laveaga and Daniel Ken Carrasco, who are looking into the connections of Khankhoje, Mexico, and the Green Revolution, and connecting that bit to India. I'm more interested in the cultural bit. Why? Because I believe that there's a reason that we don't know these stories. In particular, because these stories of nationalism go against the grain of the nationalism that we like both in India and in Mexico. The people, someone like Pandurang Khankhoje belonged to a party of revolutionaries that were classified as terrorists, that wanted to go to war, that were violent in a way that the traditional version of nationalism in India is displayed. So if we think of Indian nationalism, we think of Gandhi, we think of nonviolence. So these stories of nationalism that were created abroad, that were not Indian, have been in some ways erased from history. In the same way, with Vasconcelos, or at least this side of Vasconcelos, there's also this erasure of the influence of India in his work. Why? Because when we think about mestizaje, we like to think of it as the indigenous culture and the Spanish culture, and this is, and admittedly, I mean, this is part of the reasons Vasconcelos is criticized. So rather than defending Vasconcelos on those terms, I just want to rethink if there's something else there, not by defending the concept of mestizaje, but by thinking about what else was there. And why has this been erased? Because as a lot of nationalist histories, we only want to use what is Mexican, what it was like Mexico Profundo. So in some ways, this has been described by Mauricio at some point, like we had like a cosmopolitan view of Mexico, or a cosmopolitan moment, And then we moved on into finding the Mexico Profundo and bringing these new narratives of Mexico as something that is to be found in particular areas. So these anti-colonial solidarities and the reimagination of race, also of mestizaje, help us to understand how the nation state, or a lot of people were trying to create a nation by looking outward rather than looking inward. So I think Pandurang, Khankhoje, and the Gather Party and Vasconcelos do some of this to some extent. So this is still a work in progress. So, and as I mentioned, I'm not a Mexicanist, so if I'm saying things that you think like can be corrected, I'm happy to hear any suggestions. But this sort of enterprise brings some problems. In particular, we need to reconfigure political concepts, because when we think of intellectual history and global intellectual history, we have a canon in which we need to think of Marxism, of liberalism, of communism. And a lot of people the people that I focus did not work that way. For them, caste was the main issue, untouchability was the main issue to be resolved. They dealt with liberalism, they dealt with communism, but only to resolve other problems. Another thing that we have, particularly in this case, when we think about revolutionaries, is that we have unreliable sources. We have the colonial sources were used basically, or tell a story of these people as terrorists, because these sources were used to convict people, to hang them, to execute them. So, and in the other hand, the biographies, the memoirs left by these revolutionaries are also filled of exaggerations, because they want to be remembered at the same level as someone like Gandhi. They want to be remembered at the same level of someone like Bhagat Singh. They think of themselves as freedom fighters. The third point is that all of these things were secret societies. People were fleeing all of the time. So there are a lot of silences in this story. And finally, the way these people tell these stories are so engaging that as historians, sometimes we get along with the story, like we want to go with the story. And that is a problem, of course, because most of the memoirs are left by the family of these people. And I think to some extent, a lot of historians that have looked at this period, they are reproducing these hagiographies or these like romanticized versions of history, particularly in the Indian case. So having said that, this is Pandurang, Khankhoje. This is the focus of the paper, along with Vasconcelos. And rather than presenting a big argument about how these people come together, and what I'm trying to do is to look at a moment, at a cultural moment that is going on around the world. In some part, is a discovery to some extent of nationalism. In some part, it's a discovery of revolution. And in some part, it also tells the story of failed projects of nationalism, projects that will not be admitted or will not be triumphant as the projects of other people were. So Pandurang Khankhoje was born in Barda in 1883. This is Western India, and now in the state of Maharashtra. And the interesting thing is that, as many other Indian nationalists, before leaving India, he was just a nationalist. They were not really influenced by ideas of Marx. They were not really influenced by ideas of Mazzini. They knew about them, but all of them confessed like we did not read them. Rather, we were interested in people like Hardayal. Tilak. We were interested in having religious festivals the way we want. We were interested in confronting the British. And along with those interest that, and along with those things that are happening in India, such as the partition of Bengal in 1905 and the Russo-Japanese War, these very young men, and I must say most of them were men, decide that they want to leave India to get some military training. This was the case with Pandurang Khankhoje, who was, or at least he claims that he met Tilak several times, and it was through the help of Tilak that he was able to get into a steamer to travel to Japan, where there were already a few Indian revolutionaries there. The problem with this is that the dream is different than the practice. And people like Pandurang Khankhoje realized that Japan actually had close relations to Britain, that it was hard to get military training, that it was hard to get weapons, and they moved to China trying to find other nationalists. And this tells us a lot about the movement of labor that is going on. These people, these Indians, are moving with revolutionary plans, but it's actually part of a larger movement of indentured workers that are moving all across the British Empire. So when finally Khankhoje realizes that he cannot do much in Japan and he cannot do much in China, he starts looking into the US. And in 1906, with the big earthquake in San Francisco, suddenly the United States is in need of this working force. And people like Khankhoje, but also M. Roy and others move or use this period of time to get into the United States, where the immigration rules at this point are relaxed to some point. So while this story up to here is somewhat uncommon, it is actually not strange. Why? Because there are many Punjabis that are already coming to the West Coast of the United States. There are several points in which Indians are staying along the West Coast. So we have people in Southern California, we have people in Seattle, and all of them have like these connections among themselves. They have networks, they give each other, they host each other in their houses, and so on. And it's here when we start to see some of those Mexican-Indian connections. And Karen Leonard has, she wrote about this like several years ago. And we have like this connection of the Mexican Punjabis, or the Punjabi Mexicans. In her book, she's Making Ethnic Choices. It's really an anthropological work. But when Khankhoje arrives to California, he realizes that he is no está llamando la atención. He's not really like, he can pass as a laborer. He can pass as Mexican. He in the biography written by Khankhoje's daughter, he claims like, okay, I realized that here I can just go along with what's going on. And Khankhoje claims that he works, or at least like we can affirm that he worked in the field, but he was there to get some military experience. This is a somewhat pixelated photo, but what he was able, along with other Indians, to get into Mount Tamalpais Military Academy. They were waiting tables when they were doing this, but the point was to get some military training. At some point in this time as well, after this type of education, he goes and studies agriculture. And when he's studying agriculture, in his mind, he's trying to do two things. One is to help peasants in India, but the other one is to try to learn how to make explosives, right? And here is another moment that I want to sort of focus again, and where some Mexican and Indian connections are coming up. So Khankhoje is based in Lower California. Because he's from Maharashtra, he's not a Bengali, he's moving all around. So he does not fit really with the Punjabi laborers. He does not fit with the Bengali intellectuals. So he is used somewhat as a link between everyone in the West Coast. And at this point is where Khankhoje starts to sort of experience what anarchism is, or what, or where he starts to hear about communists. And I think it's actually quite interesting, like someone like M.N. Roy and also Khankhoje, even though, I mean, M.N. Roy more so than Khankhoje, of course. M.N. Roy is considered to be kind of like one of the founding figures of communism in India. They make themselves communists in Mexico. So along with those conversations about communism, there's also the conversation about anarchism. And in some way, anarchism for Indians, particularly someone like Hardayal, who is this person here, he was a philosopher, he studied in Oxford, he was given a lectureship in Oxford that he rejects and decides to go to California. He gets a job also in Berkeley. They start to organize the people there. And they focus on anarchism because in a way, anarchism travels better than communism. Because communism in some ways is always looking for the proletariat and it's based in the city. But anarchism in a way allows for the peasantry to be involved. And this is what the Indians like about the Mexican Revolution. They involve the peasants. Peasants are part of the revolution. And this is something that it's never going to happen in India. The violence that comes along in India is mostly like terrorist incidents, political assassinations. So here we see the connections between the Ghadar party, which was founded by Hardayal, and the right hand of Hardayal was Khankhoje. And we see other political movements coming along, like the Wobblies, the workers of the world, connections between Emma Goldman and Ghadar. Regeneración is writing about Ghadarites, and the newspapers of the Ghadar party are writing about the Mexican Revolution. So after this period, the United States gets very frustrated with what's going on with these Indians. They have a lot of communication with the British government, and the question of immigration starts to close up for everyone, right? For Mexicans, it starts to close up. For Indians, start to close up. For Chinese in California, and also for the Japanese. So here is when we have the Hindu conspiracy case that is tried in California, and Hardayal, M.N. Roy, Hirambalal Gupta all have to leave the US because they are going to be tried. So everyone leaves. To some extent, with some luck, the First World War I starts, and this allows for another moment of revolution. And this is where we start to see that the trace of Khankhoje and the trace of these Indian itinerants becomes flimsy. Their plan was to go to Asia to start a revolution against the British Empire, and they have German support. So, I mean, I'm going to jump this, but this is about what I was saying about the question of why anarchism is traveling better for these Indians, and because there is some criticism of how the city is important to go from the proletariat to the revolution, and how people like Engels were criticizing Mexicans as being lazy and so on, right? So here, when Khankhoje leaves the United States, at some point he appears in the Middle East, and here his memoirs become very strange. His memoirs become part of a great adventure, kind of like mirroring this great game that is being written by British writers, but also are mirroring, I think, or at least that's part of the argument of what I'm trying to do in this larger paper, is that it mirrors like the idea of the revolutionary, someone that needs to kind of renounce to their life. They need to sacrifice for themselves, for the nation. They never marry, and they give these stories about adventure where they were never had any doubts about what they were going to do. And there are several reasons for me to believe this. One of them is one story, for instance, that reflects a very similar story that of Wilhelm Basmus, who was one of the German generals that was supporting Khankhoje, or the Indians in the Middle East. And that was like both of them escaped in a very similar situation. While Khankhoje escapes from the British by pretending that he has dysentery, Wilhelm Basmus claims that he escapes by claiming that his horse was sick, but like the story and the context was basically the same. They claim to be sick several times, and then at some point in the night, in the evening, both escape at the same time. So I don't think here that we should believe Basmus or we should believe Khankhoje. Rather, all of the stories of the revolutionaries at this point in time are similar. So Khankhoje then disappears from the map a little bit, and he pops up in Europe, he pops up in Berlin, in Russia, and in 1924, he arrives to Mexico. And why is that? And that's what I'm trying to explain. The other people like Virendranath Chattopadhyay was assassinated in Russia. People like Hardayal goes back to the US and dies under strange circumstances. So Khankhoje, in some ways, either I like him too because he opens up like these moments of history, but he might not have been like an intellectual such as Hardayal, or he might not be as important in terms of strategic importance, that is, but he represents something. And in 1924, he arrives to Mexico. Why? He's not the only one. Perambalal Gupta also arrives, and this is what I'm trying to do. And then here, the cosmopolitan period opens up. And here we have Vasconcelos. And the bit about Vasconcelos that is interesting to me is that before writing about mestizaje in a nationalistic way, he's writing about India. He's also in exile. And it is in exile when he starts reading about Buddhism, where he starts reading about the Gita. He claims, Vasconcelos in his memoirs, he claims that with the foundation of the Ateneo de Juventud, all of them were reading about Indian history, or all of them were reading about Indian philosophy. But the interesting thing here is that in his reading of the Buddha, in his reading of India, Vasconcelos basically brings this idea of mestizaje or of the mixing of races that is being used by low-caste intellectuals like Jyotirao Phule. And this is quite interesting because there was a big debate about race and caste and how caste could be explained via race. And the idea here was that Aryans conquer India, and then you have several castes of importance, and the Brahmins, the caste that is on top of the caste system, were basically the whiter people. But the way Vasconcelos read this is not that way, which could have been easier for him to do in his notions about mestizaje. Rather, he adopts the vision of low-caste intellectuals that said, like, the Aryans came, they conquered, but they did not conquer because they were better. They conquered because they were savages. All of the ideas of spirit, all of the ideas of religion that make India what it is are coming from the people that are now considered to be lower caste. So in this fascination, of course, Vasconcelos never renounced to Catholicism, but in this fascination, he sees in India spirit, something that could serve the world in other ways. In El Maestro, we also see that there is a lot of that the magazine that the journal is following the Indian independence movement. This is Gandhi. They in this particular note, they're discussing how he was arrested and how he was liberated. But the most interesting thing for me is the way that this ideas about India are left behind in Vasconcelos' educational project. And in particular, the way this is from the patio de fiestas. So it's like a quadrangular patio, and you have four corners. And in one of them, you get the Buddha. And when Vasconcelos is describing the reason behind this, he claims, okay, the Buddha wrapped by the lotus flower as a suggestion that it is in this land, Mexico, the East and the West, the North and the South will come together, not to clash or destroy each other, but to combine and join together as a new loving and synthetic culture. So I like this bit because, I mean, I know like I'm pushing the envelope, but it is real. I mean, what he's trying to do is, mestizaje is not really about race at this point, but it's really about bringing cultures together in a different way. So here we can see what he's including. He's including the Aztecs. He's including the Spanish with the carabelas. Bartolomé de las Casas. It's like the note. He's including Greece, and he's also including the Buddha, as we already know. But I mean, these are the ones that are that everyone can see. But in his office as well, he has a mural by Roberto Montenegro, where we can see some of the story of the Buddha. Here is not really Indian, it's more of a Japanese vision of the Buddha. But here we have Estudios Indostánicos. So we have like different religious ideas that he's trying to bring together. And all of this is captured by Tina Modotti. And I mean, I know I'm running out of time, but the point here was that all of this openness towards Indians are going to open the doors to people like M.N. Roy, are going to open the doors to people like Heramal Gupta, are going to open the doors for Khankhoje. So the connection here, and the way we know that Khankhoje was in Mexico to some extent, is that Khankhoje met Diego Rivera while Diego Rivera was commissioned by Vasconcelos to paint the Capilla Riveriana in Chapingo. So all of these pictures are by Modotti. And here we can see, in theory, this is the part of the agricultural experiments that Khankhoje was doing. And here I say, here's where people like Soto Leaveaga and Daniel Ken Carrasco, I mean, they start their narrative of the Green Revolution. But if you look into the sources of former students of Chapingo, they say like, well, Khankhoje era un buen hombre, pero no hablaba español y no sabía de genética. So that's different, but it tells a story that he was there and he was trying to be involved in, at least at this period when he did not know if he was going to return to India. So this is part of like his work. This is called what we call Maíz Granada, which it was like trying to get a corn without the husk. He was also involved. Here is Khankhoje. He was with the connection of Diego Rivera and some others. He was involved in the creation of some schools, agricultural schools, and he was the director of a few. Although we don't know how well did he do. So, for instance, this is Escuelas Libres de Agricultura del Estado de Veracruz and Director General Ingeniero Pandurang Khankhoje. So he produces, and we have like 1 or 2 reports of what he has done, but there is no real evidence that he of the type of contact or the way that he engaged with peasants or people doing or with the rural communities. So at this point in time, I'm sorry, I'm leaping. At this point in time, Khankhoje is always trying to go back to India, even though he doesn't mention this in his memoirs. He's trying to apply for a passport. He's denied a passport by the British authorities, and the only way he's able to go back is by becoming Mexican and then getting a passport to go back to India as a Mexican. This is a picture once he returned to India, and he's with other gather rights, other freedom fighters. But the interesting thing, and this is what I was trying to hint at the beginning, is that these stories do not leave a trace in the way of the national imaginary. Why? Because if we look into other murals at the CEP, at the Patio de la CEP, we find that Khankhoje was not the only Indian there. We have Tagore, and we have Diego Rivera mocking Vasconcelos and mocking the idea that Vasconcelos is trying to bring the classics, that is trying to create a new culture that is taking India as an example. We have Taboada as well, and so on. But Tagore and India was not the only one. We also have Khankhoje, and this is how we know like Khankhoje and Rivera were close. But this guy here, it's also another Indian. This is Heramlal Gupta, and people have not sort of discussed this. And I like this bit of that Rivera calls this mural Nuestro Pan, and in a way, it's kind of a play of words. Nuestro Pan it's of course a reference to Nuestro Pan de cada día, Danos Nuestro Pan de cada día, like the prayer. But it's also the way he used to call Pandurang. At least Diego Rivera used to call him Pan Duro. It was like un juego de palabras, Pandurang, Pan Duro. And rather than just saying like we are giving that communism is going to feed the masses, it's also a way of just presenting his friend Pandurang. And I'm gonna leave it at that.
Okay. Well, if you can show your hand in this electronic way so that we can have some questions for my good friend Jesús. Any question? Bueno, Jesús, let me then ask you, as you know, I work on this, some of these issues, and want to ask you two specific issues, because for people might not be familiar, but in fact, as you and I and many others have shown, you know, India, Japan, China were present in many ways, and Vasconcelos was a great admirer of India and the influence of Tagore. You know, M. Roy is the founder of many communist parties, among them Mexican Communist Party. But there is always, and this is what I want to ask you, the intermediation of the US, which is part of the business. As you know, they all come from the US, they are escaping the German or the American or the British intelligence. And so, and the intermediation of Germany. So let me ask you about whether you know something I never could find. I mean, I'm happy you and Wakuha were able to find more about Akhil Gupta, who, as I mentioned, and I never found out anything, though Modotti and Edward Weston, they all mentioned cooking with him. And but what was the first question is, in this intermediation, what was Jordan, the Stanford president, the president of Stanford, doing, helping them to go to Mexico with his connections in Yucatan? Why Jordan, who was such a, so to speak, wealthy and very well connected, helping these crazy guys? And second, of all these guys that end up in Mexico and everything, why some of them ended up in Berlin, including M. Roy, and then they even share lovers and have, what happened? Why were they all going to Germany?
Well, I think like I can focus more on the second question, because I'm not sure about like the thing about Stanford. I know like they're linked to Mexico for M. N. Roy and for Khankhoje and Hiramlal Gupta were different. For Khankhoje was Ramon Pedenegri, the person that sort of that linked him to Mexico. For Gupta, it was more of Vasconcelos, or at least Gupta sort of claims that it was Vasconcelos that brought him back to Mexico. And as you know, like Gupta sort of publishes one of Tagore's, he translates one of Tagore's books, Chitra. And for M. N. Roy, I think there were more of the connections of
Yucatan.
But I think there were the connections of something. I mean, this is something that these people don't do as well, because all of them have like either European or American women as partners, and they don't discuss this in their memoirs, because I don't think it goes with the notion of who can be a revolutionary, at least in India. So I think in the case of M. N. Roy, they were using those connections that perhaps they were not his connections, but rather were the connections of Hardayal and the connections of Agnes Smetliff, I think, if I'm not mistaken. In terms of Gupta and ending up in Berlin, here the idea was that the German government was trying to support Indian revolutionaries in Singapore and in Asia. That's why there was the connection with Wilhelm Basmus. And here, let me show something. I haven't found much, but I found recently this thing when I was looking about Khankhoje. This is where all of them, it's Bhupendranath Datta, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Pandurang Khankhoje, and Hiramlal Gupta. They are giving a letter of recommendation to this Dutch socialist, Henk Sneevliet, and all of them are in Berlin. And I think they were being funded to some extent by Germany. But as they mentioned at this point in time, someone like Khankhoje mentioned at this time, they did not have a great communication. They did not know what was going on in India. When the Berlin sort of money dries out, Khankhoje and Chato, they end up in Moscow. So they are moving all of the time. I don't think, I mean, I always say that I believe like we should study intellectual history as it is, but at this point in time, I think, to be honest, they were just trying to survive. They were not really linked ideologically to anything. And maybe it's not a great answer, Mauricio. No.
Okay, any question? Show your hand or just speak out, please.
I have a brief question.
Refugio.
Oh, okay.
Sí, Refugio. I really don't follow the chronology that you put down, Jesus. I think what is needed is a little history of the individuals. You know, how, you know, why are they important? How did they basically, you know, contribute to the history of Mexico? I think that's what I would like to see more of, and to really understand the mestizo in us.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, this is like part of like the format. Like this was like, I mean, this is a long chapter, a long presentation. But part of it, it's me trying to kind of, and I understand that because it's hard, and this is part of the problem of doing this type of history. When I present this and when I write about these things, the Mexican is one more Mexico, the South Asian is one more South Asia. But I'm trying to. The point is trying to problematize the question of mestizaje, that there is not only about Mexico. It was about something else as well, and those histories are not recognized precisely because we are not talking about Mexico. But I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I will take it on board.
But just to clarify, I think as in the Katz Center, nobody has to explain who is José Vasconcelos and his importance. Well, the interesting thing is that we always see two Vasconcelos, the one seen from Mexico in different ways, which is very complicated, very clinical too, but very complicated. There are too many Vasconcelos, the Vasconcelos of the autobiographer, the Vasconcelos, the Estudios Indostanos, the Vasconcelos philosopher. But unfortunately, there is the other Vasconcelos, which is seen in English by the translation of a single travel book that he did, a travel he did in Brazil in 1922 and South America. And that's all they talk about. So I'm sick and tired of reading sociological, political science, history articles and books in English. Mention the myth of mestizaje, raza cósmica Vasconcelos. It's nothing, the raza cósmica, it's just a simple travelogue. And it's very interesting to see your point of view that looking in this cosmopolitan moment in which all these people are, the mestizaje that Vasconcelos is talking about is more than racial. It's not that it's not racist, it's not that it's not, but it has a lot to do with breaking barriers between South and it's also a lot to do with anti-Americanism, as Vasconcelos was a Catholic, very anti-American, and wanted a spiritual source that was bigger than the Anglo-Saxons. For him, India, Spain, and other places were important to construct this. But the mestizaje that you mentioned it's very interesting because he idealized India and idealized the caste system. But because he was Catholic, it's funny. On the one hand, he cleaned what he said, la lujuria indostana. He hated the pornographic and erotic aspects of India. But on the other, he claimed that the success of Mexico and India will be precisely in lust, in lujuria, because unlike the Anglo-Saxons, the Latin races and the Indostano races will be safe of the race problem precisely by lust, because they will want to sleep with each other and the whole thing will be over. So it's funny that on the one hand, he cleans the Indostano thought of any erotic aspects, but on the other, he claims that it's this Latin and Indostano lust that will solve the race problem in both regions.
Yeah, I think that's part of the point, and even if we look at Vasconcelos in terms of race, like as I mentioned, there was a big debate in India at that time about caste and race, like sistema de castas, like how it was composed and whether you can explain that with in terms of race. And he is actually going against that. And at this point in time, no one can seriously just sort of like say like race was not important. And once again, I'm not trying to make a revisionist history of Vasconcelos, but even if we think of someone like Boas, like the answer that Boas makes about the Jewish community not being racially inferior is basically through a racial analysis of measuring heads of Jewish people in the States. So everyone is kind of like playing that game. And my point is like, we can sort of go beyond race, go beyond like this notion of the raza cósmica. And I think that is part of the question of global intellectual history, and perhaps is as you mentioned, that it's about the translations that we have and like the translations that people work with. But because this happens with Indians as well, like with Gandhi and I mean, I'm not a defender of Gandhi. I actually don't like him at all, and I'm very critical of Gandhi with my work on Ambedkar. But recently, Gandhi is cancelled to some extent because of his years in South Africa, where he's like he wants to get rights for Indians by claiming that they are better than the Africans in South Africa. So now we're kind of losing those legacies that are the ones that we have, the ones that of the people that wrote. And as Tolkien said, it's not about sort of trying to give space to these people, but trying to understand why those ideas make sense at that particular point in time. They were revolutionary at that particular point in time because, I mean, when we think about mestizaje, it's precisely what people omit. Is like you still needed to mix to some extent to create this new notion, which in the United States, academics were unwilling to claim. And I think actually Vasconcelos is running from these notions of mestizaje of Justo Sierra that are very, very racial to some extent. But as I mentioned, I'm not a Mexicanist.
I have a brief question on the involvement of Tina Modotti with this history. Like, do you know if Modotti was already involved with the Escuela Libre de Agricultura before meeting Khankhoje, or is Khankhoje the excuse for like that kind of work that Modotti developed later on?
I think actually this is like the connections of Diego Rivera, who is like using these muses in whether it's like Lupe Marin, whether it's Tina Modotti, and he's bringing them. He is bringing them to Chapingo, and as you know, Modotti's husband at the time was also a photographer. So I think they were all just like taking photographs of everything that was happening. To some extent, and this is just my hunch, I think actually someone like Khankhoje loses his power after well, not his power, but like his influence after the 30s, because it's the time when Diego Rivera is kind of like outed from or at least he's like silent from the communists in Mexico as well. So I think a lot of his connections and a lot of his influence was based on those friendships, and also with Ramon de Negri and all of these people. But I think Tina Modotti, yeah, I think like she gets immersed into these things through Diego Rivera.
But Jesus, do you will know whether Gupta translated Tagore from the Bengali or from the English?
It was from the English, like it's on the because Tagore he translated his own work to English, and then Heram Lalal he translated it from English, although he was a Bengali as well. So yeah, I mean that's also an interesting thing, right? Like, or at least that I find interesting in Vasconcelos' project, like. He was, and this is why he was criticized as well, which I understand by people like Moises Sanz and all this, that he's sending these books, these classics to everywhere in Mexico, to rural Mexico, and people would say like, yeah, like these people are dying of hunger, and they have Tagore to read, they have like Plateau to read, like what are you doing there? But in his mind, I think like he was convinced that was an answer to resolve something. I'm not sure what, but I think it's fascinating, to be honest. But it's not the type of nationalist history that we like to hear, I think.
Okay, if there is no other question, Professor Ortega, when is our next meeting and what is it about?
The next one is on February 7 with Jean Mayer, 2 half-breed leaders, Louis Riel in Canada, and let me double check I will double check the title because I don't want to give you the wrong information. We have, 2 half-breed leaders, Louis Riel in Canadian Northwest and Manuel Lozada in Mexican Nayarit. February 7, 1 p.m.
Is Jean Meyer.
Jean Meyer, yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay, well, I hope to see you again. Thank you very much, Jesus.
Thank you for having me, Mauricio.
Bye.
And Alberto, see you.
Thank you.